Hey, Beth, what's going on? Cool. Can I try?
Sure. Well, Morse code is an alphabet code. It's a series of dots and dashes, and you write them down, and they make letters, and then you decipher the letters, and you get a message. Oh.
That sounds complicated. So why are you listening to it?
In the early days of navigation, you needed to know this so that you could navigate around the world. There weren't cell phones or radios or radar the way we have today, so people would have to learn Morse code so that they could navigate.
But to navigate, if you get close to an airport, you just see the airport and you land.
If there's an airport. In the early days of navigation, there weren't any airports, there weren't any runways, there weren't even any flight paths the way we know them today. Charles Lindbergh had to study the Great Circle route so that he could figure out how to fly from New York to Paris to make that historic flight.
What's the Great Circle route?
That's a little more complicated. Do you have some time?
I've got about 30 minutes.
This is 7:30.
Hi, I'm Beth.
And I'm Marty.
Last month on STEM in 30, we celebrated the 112th anniversary of the Wright brothers' first flight.
Now, we think today we hop on an airplane, we fly 3 hours, and we get to Grandma's house. It's not a big deal. It's a really big deal. There are air routes that have to be considered, and a lot of advancements in aviation in only 112 years.
And Charles and Ann Lindbergh really helped promote something called air-mindedness. It really got people thinking differently about how we could use airplanes in our everyday lives. We'd like to first start by welcoming our online audience, and we want to remind you to submit questions. We may be able to use them on the show. If not, we do have an expert standing by. Now, Marty, this is usually the part where I say, Marty, why don't you introduce our in-house audience?
Well, we don't have an in-house audience today, and there's one word that describes that, and that's snow. Over the weekend, Washington, D.C. was slammed with a blizzard. We got between 20 and 30 inches of snow. We affectionately called the blizzard Snowmageddon, but the show must go on, so we really need your online questions today. But today, we are coming to you live from the Baron Hilton Pioneers of Flight Gallery. Now, this gallery is filled with all kinds of artifacts from the early days of aviation. As a matter of fact, we have the Douglas World Cruiser here. This was the first plane to fly all the way around the world. There were 4 of them, all named after different cities. The one we have on display is called the Chicago. Now, my personal favorite artifact that we have here in the gallery is this Lockheed Vega. It was owned by Amelia Earhart, and she used it to fly across the Atlantic Ocean. Now, this thing was built for speed. It has wheel pants on it. Those are coverings over the wheels. It also has a single wing design and no wing struts. There's a cowling over the engine that covers it. All of those things reduce drag, which makes this a really fast airplane. Now, another airplane we're going to be talking about today is this funny looking one back behind me called the Tinghamasartog. We're going to get to that here in a little bit, but first, Beth is with our very first guest today.
I am joined by Dr. Bob van der Linden. Bob, thank you so much for joining us
Happy
today.
to be here.
Now, the Spirit of St. Louis is not in the Pioneers of Flight Gallery. It is part of the Boeing Milestones of Flight Hall, which is currently undergoing some renovation. Can you tell us when we'll be open and see the whole new hall?
It's undergoing more than a renovation, a complete new gallery.
featuring the Spirit of St. Louis and many other objects we've had before and some new ones as well. But it is scheduled to open on July 1st of this year in 2016.
Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about Charles Lindbergh to get started. Do you want to tell me, how did he get his start in aviation?
Lindbergh was the son of a congressman, and he was well educated without really having spent that much time in school. I mean, he flunked out of college. But he was very interested in all things mechanical and machines and cars and everything. And he became very interested in flight, became a barnstormer, later a military pilot for about a year or so, and then became an airmail pilot for one of the precursor airlines to American Airlines.
And delivering the mail was sort of a dangerous thing to be doing at the time, via plane, is that correct?
Well, in 1926, when he was flying the mail for Robertson, it could be quite hazardous. Most of the navigational aids that we know today weren't there, and the safety aids weren't there. And he was flying literally by the seat of his pants in all kinds of weather, but the mail had to get through.
Now, we're talking about the Spirit of St. Louis, and I noticed there's no windshield on this. So when he's making this flight from New York to Paris, doesn't he need a windshield?
Actually, no. You would think he would, but in front of him, you can see where the door is on the airplane, that's where he sat. He decided he needed fuel more than anything else, so he had 2 very large fuel tanks there, plus 3 fuel tanks in the wing. He had windows on the side, and by side-slipping the airplane or just literally looking out the window on the side, he could see ahead of him.
Now, why was this flight from New York to Paris so important at that time?
Well, no one had done a flight directly between these 2 major cities. The Atlantic had been crossed many times before, but not nonstop and not solo, a distance like this. He was doing it to win the Orteig Prize, which was $25,000 for the first person or group of people, for that matter, in an airplane to fly from New York to Paris or Paris to New York.
Now, the Spirit of St. Louis came down a few months ago, and there was some restoration, particularly on the cowling.
Yes.
And I know that you and Malcolm Collum worked together. So let's take a look at how that restoration went.
Great.
Whenever we start with any sort of project, before we lay hands on an artifact, we try to do as much historical research as possible to really anticipate things or look for particular historical clues about an artifact once we start working on it. So whenever we started the cleaning, we made sure that we weren't going to be stripping off any original materials or colorants off the flags. So we started going through, and at first we were sort of shocked. Because it was such a dramatic transformation. You really were starting to see the engine turn decoration was coming out, and we contacted Bob right away and let him know that we're getting quite a strong before and after result here, but we've confirmed by comparing our UV photography from before the cleaning and during the cleaning that basically all the original materials were just taking off dirt and grime. So what you see now is a much more vivid interpretation of what the original markings would have looked like back in the time period. You can still see some of the light yellowing that's from the original coating there, but now that all the dirt and the grime has been removed, the colors are more vibrant in the flags. The engine turning, I said, is much more vibrant.
What'd you use to clean it? I love this.
We use just water. Water on cotton swabs and slow and gentle cleaning. So it was a very tedious process, but because we're dealing with original surfaces, the last thing you want to do is any sort of mechanical cleaning or any sort of polish compounds at all, no strong chemicals whatsoever. The fact that we got such a dramatic cleaning with just straight up water was really quite a thrill to all of us.
So Bob, do you want to take some questions?
Sure.
First, we have a video question.
Okay.
My name is Kaylee Shackelford, and my question is, what did Lindbergh do when he had to go to the bathroom?
What did Charles Lindbergh do when in this little plane on a 40-hour flight when he had to relieve himself?
33 hours and 30 minutes. We don't know. Most pilots, if they're flying long distances, would usually bring a jar along with them so they could take care of business. In Lindbergh's book, The Spirit of St. Louis, where he meticulously lists everything he brought with him and everything he did, he doesn't mention that. So we really don't know. I've heard a story that he just went in his flight suit, but we don't know.
Okay, well, maybe it's better that we don't.
I think it's probably is.
Let's take an online question. Why was the plane called the Spirit of St. Louis? Where did the name come from?
Well, at that time, Lindbergh was flying, he was based in St. Louis, flying the mail from St. Louis to Chicago and back on contract air mail route number 2. When he got the idea, he approached the Robertsons, and they helped him make contacts with many other backers in St. Louis. And he got help from newspapers and banks, and they helped raise the money to build the airplane. So in honor of his supporters, he named it the Spirit of St. Louis.
Spirit of St. Louis. Now, we follow air routes, but when he was flying from New York to Paris, there wasn't a map. So how did he decide which direction he was going to go? Did he just get in and go, okay, we're just going this way?
Well, it's a long story about that. I won't go into that. But he basically said, as long as I can head east and have enough gasoline, I'll run into something, hopefully Europe. But he was much more detailed than that. He did not have much experience in navigation. What he did know, he learned in the Army, and the Army did not have experience flying over water. He did go to the local Navy base and got some rudimentary instruction there. But in essence, what he really did that was so very clever and so very simple was he went to the local library in San Diego with the roll of string, found a globe, found New York, found Paris, put the string over it, measured it, and that just automatically traced the Great Circle route between the two places. Okay, and he just went back and transposed it on an ordinary
map. Now, the Great Circle route is a little difficult to explain, so we do have an animation that we hope will help you understand the Great Circle route a little better.
Humans like to travel efficiently. Less time, less distance, and less fuel are all goals of efficient travel. Normally, we think of the shortest distance between 2 points as a straight line. So why does Lindbergh's flight have a big curve in it? On a sphere, the shortest distance between 2 points falls along a great circle. If you were to slice a globe through its center, a great circle would form its circumference, just like the equator. When Charles Lindbergh made his historic flight from New York to Paris, he followed a great circle route. When this route is unfolded on a flat map, it appears as a curved line. This is also why airline flight paths appear on maps as curved lines. They follow the curvature of the Earth along a great circle route.
All right, we're now joined by Dorothy Cochran, a curator here at the National Air and Space Museum. Thanks you so much for joining us.
Yes.
Now, the plane we're standing in front of looks a lot different than the Spirit of St. Louis. Can you tell us a little bit about this plane?
Well, this plane was built just a couple of years after the Spirit, but it incorporates a lot of things that have changed in aviation since then. And in fact, it's based on one of your favorite planes, Amelia Earhart's Vega. So it's got a lower wing and it's larger, it carries more fuel. So it's made for this exploratory type of flying that it did.
Great. Now, it's got a kind of a funny name back there, the Tingamasartog. Where did that name come from?
That name came from their second flight. They took a flight in 1933 over to the Orient or Asia, and then in 1931 they went to the Orient or Asia, and then in 33 they went across the Atlantic to Europe. They stopped in Greenland and did a lot of survey there, and there an Eskimo boy named it Tingamasartog, which means one who flies like a bird.
Awesome. Now, Anne Lindbergh was not just a passenger on this plane. She played a very vital role in that flight. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. Anne was a co-pilot of the aircraft, and she was also the radio operator. And this was a very important piece of work because she was responsible for making all the contacts with people along their flight path. So she would call all the radio stations along their intended route to find out what the weather is, to let them know where the Lindberghs were, when they expected to get in, find out all this vital information, and keep them in contact with the world.
And that wasn't a super easy thing to do because she had to learn Morse code to do that, right?
She had to learn Morse code, and to do that, she had to be able to tap on that key and really understand then also what was being transmitted back to her. So at times she referred to it as needing 4 hands to play the piano.
I don't think I'm that coordinated. But all of that equipment fit inside this airplane.
It was all in the back cockpit, which is where she was situated. So she had her telegraph key on her left hand, and she had other equipment on her right hand, plus she had her control stick right in the middle.
Wow. Now, recently, Reeve Lindbergh, the daughter of Charles and Anne Lindbergh, came here to the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. Beth had a chance to talk with her about her famous family.
Today we are talking to Reeve Lindbergh. Ms. Lindbergh, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, it's my pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
Now, your parents were truly pioneers in aviation. Your father flew the Spirit of St. Louis across the Atlantic, and your mother was a radio operator for a flight at a time where you had to know Morse code to know where you were going. So when you reflect on your family's history with aviation, what's one of your favorite stories to tell?
Well, I have a lot of stories, and one of my favorites has to do with my mother talking about, actually she wrote about this as well, she talked about when they were flying, as she called it, north to the Orient, up over the pole to Asia. They were charting the earliest air routes for the airlines, and they must have been something like 26 and 29 years old.
Wow.
Yeah. She found that she was standing with my father about to take off, and he was asked all these very kind of heavy, masculine, technological questions about the fuel and how far they were going and all kinds of things about the airplane, about the flight. And she was asked, how do you do your housekeeping in this aircraft? And so she was an early aviator. She was he said she was as good a pilot as he was, maybe better. And she would say, oh, Charles. But she also was a radio operator and a navigator, and very much part of that whole process, very much a partner, as she always was.
And she wrote about this journey in her book, North to the Orient and Listen the Wind.
That's right.
Tell us a little bit about that trek. Now, they were working to chart airline routes, is that correct?
That's correct, because there were no charted airline routes. And one of my father's jobs after his flight to Paris, nonstop solo flight to Paris, was to promote aviation and to help aviation develop. And he was asked to fly over the pole to Asia. I believe they called it the Great Circle route.
Okay.
And my mother went with him as his co-pilot and navigator and partner, and very young. They were both very young, and they went to places where the people had never seen an airplane before, and figured out the best routes for the airlines to follow.
Now, Dorothy, something that I notice on this airplane behind us, it has no wheels. Why not?
It doesn't have wheels because where they were flying, there were no airports. They are exploring. They're up in areas that do not have airports. They don't even have solid ground. So they are always looking for a place to land, and there's a lot of water, and they knew there would be. So they can, if they put the pontoons on the plane, they can land on rivers, oceans, lakes, and they're safe.
Really opened a lot more possibilities for them.
Exactly.
Now, some of the science behind the pontoons that they used involves surface tension. So we have a little experiment here. This is a real easy one to do in your classroom or at home. We have a paper clip, and if we're real gentle and put it into the water, nice and level, it'll float. So we've got this paper clip floating on the water, and that's the same principle that happens when you fill up a glass of soda and it gets all the way to the top and almost goes over, but it doesn't. Surface tension is holding that there. Well, the same thing happens with this paper clip. Surface tension is holding it on the top of the water. Now, with a plane like the Tingmissartoq that has pontoons, the weird thing is it can't take off on still water. So unless there's a ripple in the water, this plane is stuck on the ground, stuck on the water.
Right.
So you have to have a little bit of a ripple. So here in a second, I'm going to add a ripple to this water, and we're going to see what happens to the paper clip. So if I take my finger and I just add a ripple, that paper clip sinks. And that same thing has to happen for this plane to be able to take off. There has to be a ripple in that water to break that surface tension to allow that plane to actually get into the air. So there's some science behind the pontoons.
Absolutely.
Now, when Reeve was here, I had an opportunity to talk with her about some of the books that she's written, including Nobody Owns the Sky. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the book, Nobody Owns the Sky. This is the story of Bessie Coleman. Can you tell me a little bit about her story?
Bessie Coleman is one of my great heroes, and she was the first licensed African-American aviator in the world. And she was brought up picking cotton, and she looked up and she said to herself, I really want to fly, and if I want to fly, I have to get out of these cotton fields and above the clouds. And by golly, she did it. She was raised at a time when if you were black or if you were a woman, there was no chance to get a pilot's license in the US. And so she eventually went to France and got her license there and came back and taught as much as she could. She lectured and taught and told people through her own aerial adventures that anybody could fly. And I was so struck by this because she had so little publicity. My parents were overwhelmed with publicity for their aerial adventures, and it was oppressive and difficult for them to have quite so much fame, which sounds funny, but it was true. Bessie had none, very, very little at that time. And I was so impressed with her for persisting. She was beautiful as well, which is also a wonderful thing to recall and look at in the old pictures. And I started to write this little poem just about her bravery and really her sense that in the sky there was freedom.
Now, you dedicate the book to her family. Do you feel a connection with her family?
I do feel a connection with her family. I spoke on the phone to her niece, Marion Coleman, who was a wonderful woman, and I tried to contact anybody I could who had connections with the early African-American pilots, and have become friends with a fellow named Philip Hart, who has an early pilot ancestor and knew the community of the first black aviators. So I did quite a bit of research, but I really wanted this book to be for kids, and I wanted it to have a kind of poetry and cadence that would make kids want to read. Most of my books for children, all of them in fact, are in rhyme because it's for reading, and kids often will learn to read if they have a rhyme.
Wow. And one of the lines that I love out of the book is, the air has no barrier, boundary, or wall. What lessons can kids learn from the struggles that Bessie Coleman went through?
I think they can learn that you can succeed. Not so easy for a lot of kids. I mean, this is an easy thing to say, but she had as many barriers as anybody possibly could, and was able to prevail through the support of her friends, through her own determination, through her mother, who by golly was going to have her children learn to read even though she didn't. And Bessie overcame it all.
So we have discussed that the Lindberghs were actually award-winning writers as well. And Dorothy, I know that you know a little bit more about North to the Orient and Wings and Memoir. So do you want to tell us a little bit about these two books that...
Sure. North to the Orient is just a marvelous piece of aviation literature. It's just terrifically written, and it's impressive because she was working the steady radio line all the time, but she was also able to take enough notes to write this book. And it talks so much about the early years of aviation and flying close to the ground and seat of the pants flying that's pretty much unknown to us now.
And then Reeve's book talks about her Reeve Lindbergh growing up and being the youngest child.
Yeah, this is a nice inside look at the home life of the Lindberghs. As pilots, Reeve got to fly with her father, and then she watched both of her parents write. And so it's just a nice inside look at the home of the Lindberghs and growing up as a Lindbergh child.
And Marty, you like this one, and the author is right here.
I do, yeah. This is Charles Lindbergh in the Spirit of St. Louis by Bob Vander Linden. And
He'd better like it.
I really like this book because it's got so many great images in it, not only from our collection here at the Smithsonian, but also historic images of the Lindberghs and that famous flight.
Now, the last book I want to introduce is about not the Lindberghs, but about another airplane that is in the Pioneers of Flight Gallery. The Chicago completed the first flight all the way around the world. This is written by one of our educators, Tim Grove, and he worked on this exhibit and got so inspired by this story that he felt he needed to write a whole book about it. So these are some books that you all can take a look at. Do you want to take some questions? Should we take questions?
Sure.
So let's start with the video.
My name is Caitlin Francis, and my question is, how much did Lindbergh's trip cost, and where did all his money come from?
How much did the Lindbergh trip cost, and where did the money come from?
Which trip?
The Spirit of St. Louis trip.
The whole cost was about $15,000, and that money was raised by his backers, the so-called the folks in St. Louis, after whom the airplane was named. For that, he won $25,000, so he made $10,000 on it.
Okay, so that wasn't inexpensive.
How about the trip to the Orient?
A lot of money.
Yeah, how about the trip to the Orient? Do you know how much that cost?
Gosh, I really don't, but I know that Pan Am financed the aircraft and a lot of, and of course, positioned the fuel and that sort of thing. So, but I don't really have an account for that.
Okay, let's take an online question. Why did they use Morse code and not just call someone on the radio, Dorothy?
Well, because you couldn't just call someone on the radio. This was before voice communication was really sorted out, and so that was the way. The Morse code telegraph was the main way to talk through being in an airplane and to connect through the whole Morse code system. So it was just prior to voice, that's all.
So the Wright brothers invented the airplane, but the Lindberghs really kind of helped put it into our consciousness. How do you think that they did that?
Well, the Spirit of St. Louis showed that long-distance flight from a major city to a major city was possible, which meant the advent of commercial air transportation was just around the corner, and it was indeed.
But Dorothy, what about the...
Well, the Tingma-Sartok flights, you know, they're all about establishing air routes for Pan American and for all the airlines. And in fact, we still use these commercial routes today. So it's quite a legacy.
Okay, so that's the time we have today. Next month, we will be looking at African American pioneers in aviation. Why don't you check this out? Hi, I'm Beth Wilson, and I'm in the Rare Books Library at the National Air and Space Museum. Reeve Lindbergh, the daughter of Anne and Charles Lindbergh, was a writer just like her parents.
Weren't her parents pilots?
Her parents were pilots, but they were also writers. And Reeve has written a really terrific book called Nobody Owns the Sky about African-American aviator Bessie Coleman.
There was a young woman who wanted to fly, but the people said, "Kiss that wish goodbye. The sky's too big and the sky's too high, and you never will fly, so you better not try." But this woman laughed and she just said, "Why? Nobody owns the sky."
If you want to learn more about African American aviators, be sure to check out STEM in 30. So that's all the time we have for today. We'd like to thank the Gertrude E. Skelly Foundation for funding this program, and we hope to see you next month. Hopefully we'll be done with the construction.